Hello and welcome to the Passion for Creative Writing podcast. My name is John Voyevoda. Today we're talking with author Walker Zupp. And I do want to say that there's been a renovation going on for over a year below me. So, which is actually, I think, apropos considering the short story that I'm going to be reading, which was written by Walker called Tully Lieberman. So actually, Walker, you've already listened to it, but I'm going to be just editing that in here, and so people will be listening to that right now. The Spiritual Property of Tully Lieberman by Walker Zupp. Section 1. Today I intend to document how the middle-aged, physically fit, and balding Tully Lieberman lived in a house on the very edge of the city. It goes without saying that such a description could befall 100 other citizens, except Tully Lieberman was, perhaps, the greatest example of a detached citizen I ever came across. Yes, there was a terrific sense of anomie with Mr. Lieberman, which pervaded throughout his long life, and caused a great many problems to arise. Most notably, a great upheaval was endured when one morning Mr. Lieberman received a phone call from his lifelong landlady, Ms. Tangerine, a married woman of some renown in the city. Mr. Lieberman answered the phone with the usual politeness, except there, too, was an irritated twang to his vowels, because he was just about to head out the door to work. Already, his landlady was saying she wanted to sell the very house Mr. Lieberman was living in. But why on earth would she want to do that? Well, Ms. Tangerine's husband believed their own house to be too small. It required an enlargement, so the idea was to exchange the physical asset of Mr. Lieberman's house for the gaseous asset of capital, so as to begin the lengthy extensions on the Tangerine home. Now, Mr. Lieberman had absolutely no idea that his landlady was married. He was outraged, and figured there'd be a list a mile long of other things he didn't know about Miss Tangerine, who had always referred to herself as Miss Tangerine and never, ever Mrs. Tangerine. And as for the Tangerine homestead being too small for Mr. Tangerine's liking, well, where had this come from? The answer was that things came up sometimes and needed to be dealt with. It needed to be done, and the only way to do it was by removing the Tully Lieberman element from Mr. Lieberman's house. Oh, folly! Except truly, Mr. Lieberman knew about as much as the ramifications of this turn of events as the sun knew about making ice cubes. What would happen now? And Mr. Lieberman was a kind man who was middle-aged, a gentleman who was physically fit, a noble individual who was losing his hair. He calculated privately in those moments on the phone with Ms. Tangerine, who really was Mrs. Tangerine, that his collaborating with her in this instance would not be a surrender or an acceptance. He'd never engaged in combat with Miss Tangerine, nor was he in any position to categorically deny what his landlady had said. He'd give her his notice then, so that month's rent would be the final rent owed to Miss Tangerine. Indeed, Miss Tangerine agreed only to give Mr. Lieberman 2 months' notice in her capacity as his landlady. This confused Mr. Lieberman to no end. It was the beginning of March, so would he need to be out of the property by the end of March or by the beginning of April? Ah, well, both and neither, he was informed. Miss Tangerine was happy for him to move out either in March or in April. A moment of silence followed, so solemn, so misunderstood, and Miss Tangerine added that the estate agency would be arranging viewings of Mr. Lieberman's property. He'd be notified in advance if a viewing would be going ahead. Naturally, Mr. Lieberman assumed his landlady knew these people from the estate agency, but she then explained that any such assumption was ludicrous. Ha! No, no, Miss Tangerine would have zero control over these viewings. In fact, she'd much rather let this estate agency compile a list of applications from every person who wished to see Mr. Lieberman's house. Then she'd comb through them and pick the best candidate. But surely, if the purpose of her selling Mr. Lieberman's house was to generate capital, then it would be far better to do the whole thing on a first-come, first-served basis. Why not give the house to whomever wanted to purchase it first? Because this course of action would be unfair, Miss Tangerine maintained. It would go against every single principle she bravely adhered to, except the whole thing was unfair, though, wasn't it? In the long and varied history of the planet Earth, there had never been a tenant whose primary purpose was to find a landlord. This delightful conversation was brought to a staggered end when Miss Tangerine suggested that Mr. Lieberman not think too hard about the whole thing, especially now that he needed to find a new property in a month. Or was it 2 months? Miss Tangerine had given Mr. Lieberman 2 months' notice, but she had also said that it didn't matter. You see, I've forgotten already. Miss Tangerine believed this proved her point. In any case, Mr. Lieberman had been a terrific tenant, if somewhat middle-aged, physically fit and balding, and Miss Tangerine wished him all the best in his property search and hung up. Section 2. Mr. Lieberman. You work 2 desks down from my office. Your feet are large and obtrusive. Your eyes are dull and overly perceptive to my mind. Your lunch breaks are taken outside the building and suspicious as a result. I offer you everything and you take it. Put simply, your job is on the line, Mr. Lieberman, and you must earn your keep like everyone else. Honnête vivre. Do you live in a morally upright manner? Your pencils are too sharp. Your pens are too wet. Your face is too bright. No, no, no. Ni minem lader. Do you refrain from harming others? You work in the finest accountancy firm in the city, and you live outside the city. This is no good. Sum cuique tribure. Do you render to each what they deserve? That is, do you bequeath to others what they are due? You think you are kind. You think you are morally upright. You think you render each person, even your boss, me, with what they are due, except this could not be further from the truth. The truth is what is at stake here, Mr. Lieberman, and you are not preoccupied with the truth. The truth is that you are a lowly, pathetic employee, and yet you would find the truth? Kind regards, Herman Coquillon, DMC, MMA, ILY. Asterisk, driving me crazy, making me angry, I loathe you. Oh, horror, horror. What a dastardly letter Mr. Lieberman received from his boss that day. Taking the long walk back to his house on the edge of the city, that letter, those words, filled his skull with a spiritual loom of such enormity that not even his large and obtrusive feet could break free entirely from the moody shackles they imposed. What a terrible day he'd had. He'd been accused of being lazy, beating employees with sticks, defecating adjacent to the toilet, smelling bad, all of which was untrue. Of course it was untrue. There wasn't a spot of truth in any of these accusations. Yet his boss, Mr. Coquillon, had the temerity to sermonize at length on the importance of veracity, the light-bearing faculties of truth. Where did all this leave Mr. Lieberman amidst his search for a new property, though? Mr. Lieberman remembered how Immanuel Kant had died after somebody brought him something to drink. His last words were, "Est gut?" But if anything, this pointed to Kant's being poisoned. Mr. Lieberman had reached an awkward decision as he walked through the front door, removed his shoes, put the kettle on, that he would move out at the end of March. As Kant had outlined, there was positive freedom and negative freedom, complete autonomy and an independence from alien causes. Thus, in his findings a replacement property, straight away he would be forced to exercise his autonomy, which Mr. Lieberman thought indicated complete autonomy. He also set aside a large amount of money to do this, since Mr. Lieberman was not a poor man. This way he could afford to pay the requisite deposit for the replacement property and the first month's rent for the replacement property. Like Kant, he began to look. After scanning through advertisements here and there, Mr. Lieberman found what he believed to be an appropriate replacement property. It was represented by the Helpful Agency, and Mr. Lieberman called their number. Unfortunately, his inquiry was cut off by an estate agent who said that the property was no longer on the market. Why hadn't it been removed from the property listings then? Well, this was a simple question with a simple answer. All listings from the Helpful Agency were managed at the sales office and not the lettings office to whom Mr. Lieberman was speaking at the time. This didn't make any sense to our hero, who complained. So, the estate agent apologized over the phone, suggested that they start again, then asked for some details about Mr. Lieberman. What details? Oh, just a few details. Mr. Lieberman provided his name, his phone number, his address, and a thinly veiled sentiment of confusion to boot. The estate agent gasped, for a property had appeared that seemed to satisfy the criteria Mr. Lieberman had set out. What criteria? But this was a silly question, surely. It was of far more importance to know that said property was in the city. More than that, it had a front door and running water. In all honesty, for honesty is always at stake in housing situations, Mr. Lieberman was happy that he was being granted a viewing at all. There would be a viewing for House A that afternoon, except Mr. Lieberman would be at work during that time. Oh, confound his never-ending schedule! Moreover, it was the only viewing for House A, and there would be no further viewings, as the Helpful Agency was adamant that there be but one viewing that afternoon. Mr. Lieberman's affairs did not concern the estate agent, his propensity for negative freedom notwithstanding. Rather, his affairs concerned the lettings office with whom he continued to speak. The estate agent believed this to be an excellent point, a most excellent point, except the only viewing for House A would take place that afternoon, and there was nothing in the estate agent's power, in the 7 galaxies, the 6 moons, the 5 planets, the 4 kingdoms, the 3 cities, the 2 towns, the 1 replacement property available that would alter this fact. Fine, Mr. Lieberman agreed. Housing situations made Nazi Germany look agreeable. He'd have to do it during his lunch break, and as it turned out, he did do it on his lunch break that day and arrived at the viewing of House A. He discerned a line of 10 people stretching from the front door to where he was standing. He gave a verbal nudge to the pockmarked woman in front of him, inquiring if this indeed was the viewing for House A, and thank the Lord it was. But should Mr. Lieberman cut in line, he'd be banned from the viewing altogether. Our middle-aged, physically fit, and balding hero had underestimated how popular House A was, and the pockmarked woman described her state as being unenlightened. And precisely at that moment, an estate agent from the Helpful Agency exited House A with a very tall, hermaphrodite individual, and shook their hand, which sealed the deal. Without hesitation, the remaining 9 people, plus Mr. Lieberman, shook their heads, walked away and lit cigarettes, hoping the deal might fall through. He remembered how the AGM model assumed that a person who had certain beliefs believed also in the logical consequences of those beliefs. Belief, then, could be represented by a consistent set of sentences. Except Mr. Lieberman didn't really believe in anything, and his sentences were anything but consistent. Mr. Lieberman asked the pockmarked woman what she intended to do. She explained her penchant for independent landlords, then spoke a little of Proudhon's idea of world federalism. Not only had an independent landlord forced Mr. Lieberman's presence that day, he maintained, but an independent landlord had also single-handedly wasted his lunch break. Independent or not, the pockmarked woman said, "Your place will sell, probably to a person who's only in it half the year." Oh, the injustice! Yes, this was a predictable and irritating path Mr. Lieberman was headed down. He would try the trusting agency instead, but the pockmarked woman warned him that the helpful agency had forbidden her to use the trusting agency for the reason that they couldn't be trusted. Really? Was that true? For in Mr. Lieberman's booking a viewing with the trusting agency had forbidden him to use the helpful agency for the reason that they weren't helpful in the least. This warning came rather late, as you can imagine. So, what did all this matter? It was useless comparing one agency to another agency and listening to what one agency thought about another agency. No, only a fool would do such a thing. Would it not be justified to argue, however, that every estate agency in the world had at one point been a part of one originary agency? Hell's bells, poppycock! You're weird, the pockmarked woman said and walked away. Seeing he was living in a closed society as opposed to an open society, Mr. Lieberman looked at his watch. He was late for work. He sprinted back to the office where he faced the foaming wrath of Mr. Coquillion, who made sure the follies of Mr. Lieberman were on show for every employee to see. Mr. Lieberman was spat upon by Mr. Coquillion, whipped, verbally sullied, patronized, destroyed. But the reality was much worse. Mr. Lieberman survived Mr. Coquillion's onslaught and woke up the following morning knowing he had a house viewing to attend. He dressed in a set of clothes he'd never worn before and was about to begin to walk into the city when a ding was emitted by his laptop. It was an email from the trusting agency, which read, "To whom it may concern, alias Tully Lieberman. Good morning, Mr. Lieberman. You may recall some time ago that the trusting agency instructed you write a character biography to help the landlord of House B determine your eligibility for House B. But after you emailed your character biography to the landlord of House B, he read it and thought things over and decided that your character biography made him more concerned than calm, more frightened than loving, more nervous than contented, for what you provided in your character biography constituted a dearth of information, so he couldn't reach any proper conclusions about your eligibility for House B, and wants a better delineation of your circumstances, that is to say, whether you are married or homosexual, or experiencing a raise or a promotion, or if you'll be alone in House B, because the details are important, and he'd like you to supply some photographs of your current property as well, to aid in his ascertaining your eligibility for House B, so I really cannot overemphasize how important these new additions are to what will be your new and improved character biography, which the landlord of House B would like this afternoon at the latest, so your chances of renting House B at all and being eligible therefore are neither jeopardized nor exasperated. With great trust, the trusting agency." It was a shame Villafredo Pareto didn't accompany Mr. Lieberman into the city, for his investigations into residues would have been exceptionally helpful to the heavy rainfall collected in soggy blotches along Mr. Lieberman's body, turning him into an aggregate of residues. He was totally soaked by the time he reached the property. He also was worried by the manner in which he'd managed to undertake the viewing of House B at all, that is, by taking the day off, which lifted his boss, Mr. Coquillion, to even greater levels of rancor. Couched between two moderate buildings on the peak of an incline was a patch of grass all to itself, on which House B sat like a tree frog in a desert. It had tiny windows, a tiny slate roof. In the middle of the building were tiny steps leading up to a tiny door. "Adorable," Mr. Lieberman announced despite his wetness. "I feel so much better now," for the rivulets of hope had begun to run down his body both metaphorically and literally. He stood for a time, like Anaxidemus, with Atraxia's serene peace of mind and Epoché's suspension of judgment. It would have bettered Mr. Lieberman if he had been a little more skeptical. Alas, a car bearing the trusting agency's logo parked itself in the tiny driveway. The door did not open for a long time. Then an estate agent stepped out with her umbrella. Her name was Miss Knox. She gave Mr. Lieberman a look of contempt, hatred, and low opinion. She moved closer to Mr. Lieberman, so Mr. Lieberman moved closer to her. This alarmed her, and she stepped backwards slightly, and Mr. Lieberman was upset and confused as she began to reverse altogether and moved to get back in the car. Mr. Lieberman called after her. She was looking for Tully Lieberman, surely. Indeed, she was, but it had become apparent that Mr. Lieberman was an untrustworthy man who, more importantly, did not trust Miss Knox. Except he did trust her, didn't he? He walked all that way and welcomed the car with the trusting agency logo. Miss Knox was having none of this. If he didn't trust her, then they would not be able to proceed with Mr. Lieberman's application. More to the point, Miss Knox had been charged with informing Mr. Lieberman that the landlord for House B had been unsettled, made anxious, put on edge by his character biography, and regarded the lack of photography with disgust, and found Mr. Lieberman to be a repellent worm. The landlord for House B was a wealthy man, a man of rank qualities, august intention, acclaimed, famed, and admired throughout the city for his generosity and goodwill to mankind. A man who was pleased always by satisfied criteria and displeased always by unsatisfied criteria, yet here in the form of Mr. Lieberman was a pinhead determined to demean the trusting agency's belief in trust as well as all proofs of trust, for these were things they took very seriously. Do you take the trusting agency seriously? Mr. Lieberman responded by saying he wanted to resolve this dispute inside House B, as it was raining, even heavier, and he might catch flu if some intervention wasn't made. Oh, so there was a disagreement then? He did not deny there was a disagreement between himself, Miss Knox, and the trusting agency as a whole, except what had transpired was a misunderstanding and not a disagreement. That is the same thing, Mr. Lieberman, he was assured. Mr. Lieberman, our middle-aged, physically fit, and balding hero, demanded he be let into House B. It was claimed that this was a terrible idea, for it would suggest that Miss Knox trusted Mr. Lieberman when she felt nothing of the sort. Could you pin down trust as you could evil, lust, and love? Could you feel it? Trust was not a case for atraxia, as trust didn't offer peace of mind so much as it offered insurance, and the insurance business is a ghastly one. And trust wasn't a case for a poche either, since suspending your judgment was positively the last thing you wanted to do if you were determined to ascertain whether you trusted someone. Oh, this was getting more and more confusing and irritating. What could I do to make you trust me? What you need to do, so that I can trust you, has already been outlined. You need to supply photographs of your current property and write a plausible character biography so as to aid the landlord of House B in his determining whether you are eligible for House B, except the time to remedy these things has passed. But surely, if I had supplied photographs and written a plausible character biography, not that I know what constitutes such a thing, if I'd done those things, all it would have proven was that I could follow orders. That's not a definition of trust any more than an affirmation of the correct time is an affirmation of trust. For surely, trust is wrought over time, a long period of time, months or years of deliberation. To say you can determine whether you trust someone by making them follow a few instructions is worse than ludicrous. It's illogical. What type of person would propose such a definition apart from some computer, some machine? And my saying that that person can't be trusted is as ill-informed and as stupid as your saying I can't be trusted. Miss Knox had had enough, and said that that was the difference between them, and got back in her car and pulled out of the driveway. The end of March was approaching. Section 4. As much as I'm accustomed to applying Pascal's wager to the art of fiction, and therefore commentating that if the author really existed, he or she would be incomprehensible to fictional characters, who in turn would be incapable of calculating whether the author existed in the first place. I should probably just tell the truth. Mr. Lieberman sent me an email the following day explaining what happened after his viewing of House B. To my friend, Blaise. How useless it would be to say I can't fathom what mood I'm in, yet I think it's the best description I can come up with. I shan't be dishonest. This afternoon I returned from yet another disastrous viewing, House B, to my home on the edge of the city. What a kind house it is, with bay windows, verdant back gardens, country-style kitchen, and quaint bedroom in the northeast quadrant of the building, which sits alone in the wooden harbor of the dark forest. Outside there are poinsettias, red poppies, rosemary bushes and lilies, and tall oak and birch trees. How wonderful it is to be alive. Here, I think, I'm beginning to find what mood I'm in. So, I returned from House B in a state of agitation and wetness. As the weather turned from ceaseless precipitation to bitter cold, I ran into my home, took off my clothes, then stood naked by the radiator warming my bits and pieces. Rubbing my hands together, I looked at the center of the room to find my landlady hanging from the central beam by her neck. I immediately rushed over and grabbed her legs, trying to shake her back to life. But this was useless, because she'd fouled herself and was already dead. I stood back, folded my arms, with an expression of disbelief. I spotted a paper note on the dining table. Picking up it said, "Tully, I've never had any interest in enlarging my house, and despise my husband greatly, because he's wasted my life. Before hanging myself, I amended my will so that in the event of my death, which, by the way, has occurred, this house would be transformed to your name with immediate effect. You have a spiritual right to this property, and I shall endeavor to facilitate that spiritual right." And the rope affixing Miss Tangerine's neck to the central beam started creaking like it belonged in a ship. Where the wind came from, I have no idea. Then, adding insult to injury, it seemed my phone rang. Mr. Coquillian was on the other end, and he was fuming as usual, and probably on the verge of a heart attack, when he said that he'd been deliberating over the decision for some time now, and had decided to inform me on my day off to avoid any undue humiliation in the office as I cleared off my desk. He called to say he was letting me go, because he'd observed a change in my spirit as opposed to my character, a change in my gait as opposed to my mood, a change in me that had brought the morale of the office down to the bottom of the spiritual barrel. I asked if, in keeping with the beliefs of Grotius and Pufendorf, I had a right to be told the truth, but Mr. Coquillian soon cut me off, saying he loathed Benjamin Constant on the sunniest of days, and this was no time to interject points of theological interest. I had, regrettably, been melancholy, allegedly, and Mr. Coquillian couldn't have that seeping into the starched collars and blouses of my esteemed colleagues. Doubtless, he believed that I would understand, except I couldn't for the life of me understand, and said simply that such a dismissal was unfair. Unfair? Unfair? How could Mr. Coquillian be unfair? The man raved for a good while. I split my time between looking at the deceased Miss Tangerine and listening to the deranged Mr. Coquillon. Then he said to me, "I haven't been unfair a day in my life, and you don't get to where I am by being unfair." Then he hung up, and I looked out my window, and it had started snowing. I think especially now I'm drawn to stories of the absurd. Thus today I intend to document how the middle-aged, physically fit, and balding Tully Lieberman lived in a house on the very edge of the city. It goes without saying that such a description could befall 100 other citizens, except Tully Lieberman was, perhaps, the greatest example of a detached citizen I ever came across. Yes, there was a terrific sense of anomie with Mr. Lieberman, which pervaded throughout his long life and caused a great many problems to arise. And so, Walker, you've just released a book called Martha.
Correct.
And from what I'm reading, it has to do with the detectives who use a psychedelic chemical to help them in their efforts. Would you please just elucidate a bit about how that...
Yeah, sure. That's a part of it anyway. Yeah, that's half of... No, that's a third of the book. Yeah, so there are these people who use a hallucinogenic cannabis to kind of transcend reality, Philip K. Dick style, in order to catch criminals. And then the second string is about a group of corrupt politicians in Westminster who decide to make Belgium a temporary part of the Commonwealth so they can invade it in an effort to win votes. And then the final strand is I think actually the best strand of the book. It's about a policeman who has been recently let go because he's had a mental breakdown or something along those lines, and his wife is trying to come to terms with the person who she knows is her husband, but who doesn't seem to be her husband, if you know what I mean. So it's
there's a psychological disorder like that actually, where people stop recognizing people in their lives, which is actually happening here in Canada. It's a brain disease that's breaking out on the East Coast, that's one of the symptoms. Yeah, unfortunately.
That's awful.
It is, but that is actually a real disease. People stop recognizing people that are very close to them, and there's something that you mentioned in the short story, which is anomie, which is the concept of alienation. And is that a theme that you sort of like? That's certainly what I felt that short story was about. It's about alienation. Also, I can't help but notice that the main character's name, it's a very Jewish name, and you do mention Nazi Germany in the short story.
Yeah.
And they're persecuting this guy for no reason. You can't really figure out what's going on.
Well, that's funny because that's something that I was aware Lieberman was a Jewish name, but I just used the name because it was a great name. I thought Tully Lieberman was such a good name. I couldn't not use it. The World War II context is something I was not thinking about at the time of writing it, but that's the good thing about readers is that they can read lots of things into it and actually breathe more life into the story than is actually there. So that's interesting. You should bring that up.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that for sure. That's one of the things about absolutely about creative writing. I was just like reading The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, and in the beginning of that she talks about how when you're reading you actually become insane because you're all of a sudden believing in this other planet, and you're believing all these things, and it's the way that the brain works, and it's just the magic of the fact that we can derive meaning from these symbols that are words and sounds, and and so that's sort of what I got out of that, and also I really please go on. I think you want to say something.
Oh yeah, sorry. Just to address your first point about alienation, I think alienation is something I definitely write about a lot. It's because technically speaking, I'm a foreigner living in the United Kingdom, although I'm not a foreigner as
So
far as my
your
passport.
accent, I hear American or Canadian, but I also hear a bit of British. So I imagine you've grown up both in North America and the UK.
Yeah, sure. I was born in Bermuda in
Interesting.
1996.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's a part of the British Empire.
Hmm.
Although most English people I've met don't seem to know that. So yeah, it's kind of a weird experience. But anyway, yeah, you were about to
Oh,
say something.
and so Bermuda, eh? And did you
Yeah.
spend any time in the States or Canada?
I spent my parents divorced when I was fairly young, and my dad moved. He's American German, and he moved back to the States into a place called Grantham in New Hampshire. And so he lived in a house pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's hard not to live in the middle of nowhere in America, I found, unless you're in a city. I spent a lot of time there when I was young, and I do have distinct memories of because he would go out to work during the day, and I would either watch films or try to read books. He had a lot of books on the Vietnam War, like Paco's story, um, and I did a lot of writing there. It's funny you should bring that up. I haven't thought about that in a long time, but I've spent the majority of my life in the UK, about 8 years.
Okay, and
Yeah,
like one of the things that happens in the short stories, you make a lot of references to a lot of different things,
yeah.
and so you talk about Proudhon,
Mhm.
which I found interesting. And are you an anarchist?
Absolutely not. I'm I am I I struggle so much to define myself politically. I'm a deeply moral person. I do believe in the same way that I think William Burroughs was a deeply moral person, even though his books were and his life were completely seemingly out of control. Um, uh, I would probably describe myself as a kind of centrist. Um, I remember Peter Cook, the British comedian and satirist. He called himself a kind of a Tory anarchist. Though I went through a phase of that certainly, but I don't think I'm that today.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah,
Okay.
going
And
completely off topic.
well, no, not necessarily. It's just there's a lot of references in the books. You talk about Antraxia, which I'm not sure what that is,
Yeah,
and you
neither
talk.
am I.
Oh, okay.
You know.
And yeah, and like you were saying in the piece about theological arguments and stuff,
Sure.
and so in terms of alienation, like I've been through an experience where I've been evicted
Yeah.
from a home that I lived in for 17 years,
Mm.
and so I could really relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's and also I could also relate to this idea of what happens in our society when we're so divorced from each other.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that alienation is a part of your writing, and is that like reflective of your own experience?
Yeah. Sure. Christ, yeah. I've 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 only recently acquired a very lovely partner who lives with me right now. But so that's been about just over a year. But for 7 years before that, I was pretty much alone in the UK. I have friends in the UK for sure, but I don't have it. I never had anyone to come back to, and or as some or as you would say, no one to call when I get back to the hotel. In terms of a national alienation, certainly, I went to a British boarding school for the last 2 years of high school. Over here, they call that lower sixth and upper sixth. So I did high school up to that point in Bermuda, and then I went over to the UK to do my last 2 years of high school, thinking I was very British and English, and I would be welcomed as part of that. And I really wasn't. There were most people were pretty nice to me, but as I've said before, there were some people who were very keen to say that I was not English, and so immediately you have a kind of weird identity crisis. Um, yeah, which I'm just starting to get over. Yeah, I feel deeply alienated in the UK for a variety of reasons, and yet I have an English girlfriend, so I don't know.
Interesting, interesting. And
You know,
so why do you write?
why do I write? I don't seem to be much good at anything else. I would describe it as a compulsion. Um, it doesn't matter what job I've had. I worked at home base, which is kind of like the British equivalent of Home Depot or something. I've worked on the bar, as in a drinking bar, not as in the a law bar.
Right, because you do make some legal references in your short story. Yeah.
Yes, that is from zero experience. Uh, but no, no matter what jobs I've had, I've always ended up writing on the side. Um, I can't. I wish I could explain why, and I think that if I could, I'd probably stop writing. Um, and I don't know. Why do you write?
That's a different question. Like I come from a Slavic background. My mother's from Russia, my father's from Poland,
Mhm.
and so they had horrible
Wow.
times in Eastern Europe. They came to Canada, and I was kind of the story collector in my family.
Wow.
And I was my father was a repressed writer who always wanted to be a writer, and so ever since I was a kid, I wanted to write, and then I did some writing, and then I stopped for a really long time, and I
Yeah.
just recently got back into it.
Hmm.
But Freud says that artists are artists because they want beautiful lovers and ego gratification, and it's not, it's funny, but like that's Freud, right? And that's really what he thinks. And I remember as a young person, there's no doubt about it that, like, I went to theater school, for example, so.
Sure.
And there was no doubt about it that that was a big part of it, but then it changed. Especially with writing, because I think writing, you get to really delve deep.
Hmm.
It's a big exploration. It's a huge effort, I find, and so I'm just curious. What it sounds like. It's just something that you've always done.
I have, I think you could say I've always written. That my mom has an enormous collection of little stories and stuff that I wrote when I was very, very young. Um, and then I seemed to stop writing, which is, I think, a common thing. It's good you mentioned that because writers tend to write furiously when they're quite young, and then they stop, probably because they're aware it's socially repulsive. There is something deeply repulsive about any kind of artist because they represent the world in ways that are meant to kind of bring out the deeper truth, or so they think, or their version of truth. I think there are brands of truth, and writers certainly function in that sphere, um, which is, of course, disgusting to people who don't know what it's like to write a story, um, because it's confrontational. It's innately confrontational. And I do like that element of it. I'm not confrontational in person. I like to think I'm quite easy to get on with. I like people, um, but I am extremely confrontational in my writing, you know, with ideas, with not with groups of people necessarily, because I don't think I'm in any position as a writer to judge any of the characters in my writing. I don't think I ever judge Tully Lieberman apart from saying he's bald, and but that's kind of spurious. Yeah, I think Tully Lieberman is definitely a stand-in for me. Um, I identify a lot with Tully Lieberman. That sense of the entire it's the Coen brothers thing. It's the innocent man or woman against the world. The
Coen,
world has turned against them.
Coen brothers are Jewish, and
Yeah,
it's
sure.
and so it's interesting, and that's certainly what I got out of that, just because you can't
Hmm.
really figure out why he's hated so much,
Yeah,
and so and also just sort of the just being lost in
yeah,
like when you're being evicted, it's a crazy feeling. It's a really
yeah.
crazy feeling, and it's also it really brings out the fact that we're so removed from each other in our society, and we're so removed from the earth and all that.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so are you continuing to write? Are you writing anything right now?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm drafting again a book called The Nakadai Notes, which hopefully which is coming out next year with Montag.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. So that's my second book with them. But that book is in my mind. It's more or less finished. It's just getting it right on the page. But that should be easy enough with what I've got now. There's another project which I'm still in the throes of working on, which is a book about a white family in a British Commonwealth territory. You know, kind of like an islander family. And I think the best way to describe it is something like Sound and the Fury. So it's like a Bermudian version of Sound of the Fury, basically. And I say white family because there's a big difference between a white family on a British territory and a black family, especially in the time period I'm setting, which is just after World War II. Um, so yeah, I've got that. I mean, that's the more major project in terms of work, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
what are your writing habits?
My writing habits. I have only recently started taking days off because I saw that it was ruining my life. um, um, I when I wrote Martha, I wrote every day religiously, and I mean like 7 days a week. Yeah, and not just Martha. You know, other short stories, which or poetry, some of which was published, some of which was not. Um, Today, I'll write. I get up quite early just because I wake up. I wake up at like 5:30 or 6. My partner's a painter, so she's out of the door by about 9 usually. So I'll sit down and I usually work for about 3 to 4 hours with little breaks in between. Um, yeah, I rarely do anything in the afternoon. Um, I, when it's nonfiction, like I'm writing a paper right now for the postgraduate conference at Exeter. I have to kind of do all that in one day because I really hate writing nonfiction, like academic essays. It's really not my cup of tea.
And so, your
So
book was reviewed in the Exeter
yeah,
paper, and did you are you alumni?
um, I am I'm still I've submitted my PhD in creative writing, but I'm still waiting for my Viva, which is my final exam. So I have no idea when that's happening.
PhD in creative writing. That's great. Congratulations
Yeah,
on that.
thank you. Yeah.
And in terms of marketing your work,
Yeah.
are you doing any of that? Like, how are you going about that?
I mean, this is talking with you is definitely a part of it. I did the Exeter paper. I send out review queries to places. That's about it, really.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really do much else,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
And so, Walker, thank you so much for meeting with me and talking with me. And I'm going to be providing a link to your book underneath the podcast.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Yeah, please.